Welcome again to our fifth seminar in our Called and Co-Responsible series. My name is Tim O'Malley. I'm the director of McGrath Theology Online and academic director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. One of the major themes we wanted to take up in this seminar was the interrelationship between devotional Catholicism, the devotional life, sometimes called popular piety, and co-responsibility. The links between the two are not hard to find. In the Church's directory on popular piety in the liturgy, we discover the close connection between the two. The Christian is initiated into the Church, baptized, and receives the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, and is to make of one's life a living and holy sacrifice pleasing to God. And the document notes that popular piety assists the faithful in persevering in prayer on this very priestly basis. It sustains them in vigilance until Christ comes in glory, and it justifies our hope in the Holy Spirit of life eternal, and conserves important aspects of a cultic context, and in different ways and varying degrees expresses these ecclesial values which arise and develop within the mystical body of Christ. We felt this was especially an important topic, having ourselves been often many of us lay people were at home and unable to attend regularly the sacrifice of the Eucharist at our parish, and yet it was this devotional life that could sustain us, and we thought it would be worthwhile thinking about retrieving it, especially its role in co-responsibility. Here's how today will go. We'll first hear from Dr. John Cavadini, director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life and professor in the Department of Theology here at Notre Dame. We'll then turn to two panelists reflecting on this theme. First, Dr. Maria Morrow of Seton Hall University, and Anna Nussbaum Keating, Catholic author and a dear friend of the McGrath Institute, who's spoken at our conferences before and is featured regularly in both our journal and on our radio show, Church Life Today. We'll then open everything up to you for questions, which we're going to take today in the chat bar, and we'll call on you just as we've done before for the other seminars. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to Dr. John Cavadini, who will begin our reflection on the forgotten devotional life.
This is an exploratory session, just like all of our sessions this summer. The theme of co-responsibility, like I mentioned when I spoke before, is itself a kind of theme, I would say, under construction and seeking development. And our goal in these summer seminars is to provide some basis for developing it. And so each of these sessions is a little bit exploratory, hoping to provide some of that basis. And this is certainly true of what I have to say in these first 20 minutes. I'm not offering a kind of prescription. I'm trying to, in a sense, offer an invitation, I guess you could say, to explore with us, to explore with me, and to explore on your own, and to use what I have to say and the links that the handout provides as a way of thinking about this topic for yourself too, and with others as you see fit. So if you can see the handout, I just titled it 9 mini points on co-responsibility and devotions. So they're not like major points. I don't want them to be too daunting. So they're just mini points. And I'm going to take them one by one. So the first one is, why talk about co-responsibility and devotions together? So what's the point of bringing these two topics together? They don't, at first glance, necessarily seem to be related. But I think that they're related because devotions are a domain of Catholic life that has been and is now and can be in the future a domain of lay leadership, especially insofar as it can be a domain of evangelization. So in a sense, you could say that with a dropping out of at least in Anglo culture in the United States, with the dropping out of the whole devotional life since Vatican II, or a seeming loss of most of it, you've also had a kind of you could talk about more of a clericalization then of the public worship of the church. And I'm not saying it's not appropriate for that to be true of the Eucharist, but insofar as you begin to narrow your options down to Eucharist and nothing else, you also end up creating a domain in which the lay leadership basically is gone or is missing. So I'd like to think about recovering that domain. Therefore, to talk about recovery and revitalization of devotional life in the church, not a retreat into nostalgia. This is not a seminar about trying to get back to the 1950s or early 1960s in my childhood. It's rather an attempt at rediscovery, reappropriation, and cultivation of traditional forms in our new situation and with new opportunities. So that's why these two topics place together. Even just putting them together, I think, is an invitation to think farther and creatively. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point, why has the domain of devotion been, and why is it especially ripe for a domain to be a domain of lay leadership in the church? It's because the domain of devotions is one which can be especially suited for exercising the vocation of the baptismal priesthood to declare the wonderful deeds of him who has called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. That beautiful passage from 1 Peter that I brought up when I tried to introduce the topic of co-responsibility. That's proper to the vocation of the baptized. And this, and there's a reference to this. I've included a reference to this in a document for which I provided a link. Tim quoted from it earlier, but this is the Congregation for Divine Worship's Directory on Popular Piety and the Liturgy, which was published in 2001. And the handout has the link to that publication. It's rather long, but if you'd like to take a look at it, the document, I think, was written because of the sense that somehow, since the Second Vatican Council, all of these devotions are this very rich domain of Catholic life had just vanished. And I think it was an attempt to, at least in white European and Anglo-American society, it had vanished. It hasn't vanished, actually, from Catholic life, but from those domains it had. Anyway, and it attempts to talk about the balance between the Eucharistic liturgy and the devotions. So I picked this quote out. Through the sacraments of Christian initiation, the faithful become part of the church, a prophetic, priestly, and royal people called to worship God in spirit and in truth. The church exercises this task through Christ and the Holy Spirit, not only in the sacred liturgy, especially in the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, but also in other forms of Christian life, among which are numbered the various forms of popular piety. On this priestly basis, popular piety assists the faithful in persevering in prayer, in praising God the Father and witnessing to Christ, and sustaining their vigilance until he comes in getting glory. So the domain of devotion is the domain both of sustaining our own vigilance, our own faith, and also a way of helping others to do that, providing a venue for it, and therefore it becomes a basis for evangelization. Evangelization doesn't always have to be direct and clunky teaching like we professors sometimes do, but it can be the invitation into a life where the images of the devotional life fill the imagination and nourish conversion in that way, for example. Anyway, so this co-responsibility and the devotional life are connected because they are located as a venue for the exercise of the baptismal priesthood. And I'm trying to find all kinds of creative ways to think about lay leadership as under the rubric of co-responsibility, like I mentioned the first time I spoke. Okay, so point number 3. The Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life, probably the most famous passage from all of Vatican II, from Lumen Gentium. The other sacraments, and indeed all ecclesial ministries and works of the apostolate, are bound up with the Eucharist and are oriented towards it. For in the Blessed Eucharist is contained the whole spiritual good of the Church, namely Christ himself, our Pasch. That's from Vatican II, Presbyterorum Ordinis, and the Catechism quotes them together. So friends, here's the starting point, really. The Eucharist is the source and summit. And so I think you could have developed, maybe before Vatican II, a situation where some of the private devotions, et cetera, were sort of seen as competing with the Eucharist. And so you've got a sense in which the Eucharist, in a sense, is being phased out, or else you have a sense in which the Eucharist became kind of, for the laity, a sort of spectator event where they weren't really participating. And the Second Vatican Council tried to bring back that full participation, which is the full exercise of the baptismal priesthood and the highest exercise of it in our participation in the Eucharist. But I think a side effect of that, perhaps, was to start thinking about it as a zero-sum game, so that so that the Eucharist ended up competing with the other devotions, and you could say phasing them out, so that they were basically vanished. I'm not sure if that's why, but I think with the emphasis on the source and summit, I think that was taken in a way the Council did not intend, namely with a sort of zero-sum application. And it got to be out of fashion, I think, to participate in these devotions, and they slowly, maybe rather even quickly, eroded away. But I'd like to suggest, at least at the premise of what I'm talking about here, is that if the Eucharist is source and summit, it can't be zero-sum, right? If it's source, it's that from which all this other rich devotional life flows. And if it's summit, it's that towards which they're oriented, just like Presbyterorum Ordinis says. It's ordered back towards that. So in a sense, the Eucharist, which is the source of Catholic devotional life, wasn't intended to snuff it out. But the point was to try to reestablish the balance where the Eucharist truly was the source and everything flowed from that, and that the devotions ordered us back to the Eucharist, so that you had a whole full range, really, of the Eucharistic life in this way. So number 4, the proper relationship between the Eucharistic liturgy and other devotions, so-called popular devotions, flows from this principle, correctly understood. The document to which I gave you the link is kind of the Holy See's attempt to articulate this balance. It's rather lengthy and rather detailed, as I said, but I think the little quote that I gave offers a kind of first step towards this balance. You can also see this quote. I gave another quote. It's on the handout. The correct relationship between these two expressions of faith must be based on certain firm principles, the first of which recognizes that the liturgy is the center of the Church's life and cannot be substituted by or placed on a par with any other form of religious expression. Because if you do that, you're saying, that the representation of the sacrifice of Christ, so that we're welcomed into the very hour of Calvary in the Eucharist, is somehow secondary to anything else. But a minute's contemplation would be able to see that's the source of everything. That's where it all comes from. So That's where any talk about devotions has to begin. And if it begins to supplant it, then you don't really have true devotion anymore. Moreover, so the second part of this, though, it is important to reaffirm that popular religiosity, even if not always evident, naturally culminates in the celebration of the liturgy, towards which it should ideally be oriented. This should be made clear through suitable catechesis, which is another domain of lay leadership. So if the devotion is authentic, it will by its very nature order you back to the Eucharist, towards its source. So there's the relationship, it seems to me. And number 5, I think a key element here, and it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks, but I wonder if this, in a sense, is why this seeming bifurcation grew up between the Eucharist and the devotions, or one reason it had the effect after Vatican II of displacing the devotions. We can tend to forget that the Eucharist itself includes a devotional element. That is, you can see this expressed, for example, in some of the traditional Eucharistic hymns. For example, the famous hymn of Thomas Aquinas, Adoro te devote, which I've also included on the handout. It's very familiar maybe to people. I adore you devoutly, Godhead unseen, who truly lies hidden under these sacramental forms. My soul surrenders itself to you without reserve, for in contemplating you, it is completely overwhelmed, etc. So and then there's of course the antiphon, O sacrament most holy, O sacrament divine, all praise and all thanksgiving be every moment thine. These are devotional expressions, right? And they seem to have dropped out of a lot of contexts for some reason. I don't know what the reason is. Some of the hymnody that we tend to find at liturgies is more interested in talking about the Eucharist rather than, in a sense, expressing devotion to the Eucharist. So I would suggest that one key to thinking about the integration of the source and summit with the other devotions is to recover a sense of Eucharistic devotion, of a sense of the Eucharist itself as a locus of devotion and the most important one. And then you can easily see, right, how devotion to the Eucharist, devotion to the Eucharist flows into all the other devotions, and how the devotions then point their way back to that. And I'm going to explore that in the 4 remaining points very quickly. So number 6, this means that participation in the devotional life of the Church can be a lower stakes way of participating in the Eucharistic life. For people who, for some reason, feel they can't receive the Eucharist or are not in a position to receive the Eucharist, I think this is very important, friends, because once the devotions dropped out, it became like all or nothing. So some people just aren't ready to go to communion. They aren't ready for the high stakes thing. But there's nothing else. I remember Virgil Elizondo, God rest his soul, he told me the story of when the relics of Saint Therese of Lisieux came to San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio and were, available for public veneration. He told me that there were lines out of the church 24 hours a day, the whole time the relics were there. That's not true of Mass. But I'm not saying it shouldn't be true of Mass. But the thing is, why? It's because people felt the welcome of the saint. People felt they didn't have to be perfect to venerate the saint. They didn't have to they didn't have to be canonically appropriate. They didn't have to have anything but themselves and their needs. And so there's a way in which there's a kind of hospitality there. But ultimately, friends, what I'm trying to suggest is that if you think of this correctly, it's Eucharistic, because the saints are formed and bound in the community of saints, which is created by the Eucharist. The Eucharist makes the church. So that this is a kind of lower stakes way of bringing people back, of welcoming people in. And as the Holy See says, with the appropriate catechesis, which is our domain, we can use it that way. It doesn't have to be the relics of Saint Therese on a national tour, but it can't. But the relics of the saints are available in every church, and I'm trying to get away, you see, from the sort of a kind of privatized understanding of devotions, which I think is a sort of nostalgic version, and the way in which you can think of them as expanding the Eucharistic possibilities, not competing, but expanding. I like the sort of distinction between low stakes aspects of liturgical life and higher stakes. Also, I think another thing that kills devotional life and that cuts off its evangelical possibility is number 7, the seeming dichotomy between devotions, the devotional life on the one hand, and Catholic social teaching on the other hand. Somehow people seem to think they have to sort themselves out. Like, I'm a devotions person, or I'm a Catholic social teaching person, and therefore I can't have anything to do with devotions, because the two things are, one thing is sort of 1950s whatever, and Catholic social teaching is contemporary. Well, look, I want to tell you something. Catholic social teaching is 19th century. That's where it started. And the devotions, what I'm trying to suggest, there's a sense in which this kind of thinking has kept them privatized, has allowed them to remain in a kind of nostalgic backyard or something. And so I'm trying to suggest that this is a false dichotomy. Why? Because they both flow from the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the source and summit, and they both point you back towards the Eucharist. So that's point number 8. This is because all devotion flows from and is ordered to the Eucharistic devotion. And remember that the Eucharist commits us to the poor. That's right out of the Catechism, 1397. Point number 9, why does the Eucharist commit us to the poor? Adoration of the Eucharist in Mass, outside of Mass, Eucharistic devotion is devotion, think about it, friends, to the mystery of the greatest disvestment imaginable, that the eternal Word of God, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, the richest person in the universe, you might say. He has everything, including divinity, empties himself. So it's a disvestment, doesn't cling to that status, disvests himself, and the Eucharist is the memorial of that disvestment, and to the bitter end, right? Didn't back out at the moment of death, or the moment, didn't come down from the cross. No, he threw his lot in with us completely. So you've got this adorable disvestment. That's what that is. A disvestment that calls forth adoration and that calls forth devotion. And the more you are devoted to that mystery, the more the preferential option for the poor comes naturally. It's folded in. Because in a sense, in God's eyes, we're all the poor, right? The preferential option for the poor means the preferential option for human dignity, period. Shorn of all the things that we prefer, like money and status. So Eucharistic devotion is devotion to that disvestment by which, as Paul says, I have it in the handout, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. That beautiful, beautiful passage from 2 Corinthians 8. So the whole of Catholic life is thus seamlessly devotional and Eucharistic at the same time. And they feed into each other. So I'm trying to suggest that let the source and summit thing function. Instead of being the zero sum, which is not source and summit, right? Zero sum is an absolute, which doesn't flow into anything and doesn't have anything pointing. But I'm suggesting recovering the whole dynamic, and that there's a whole domain in there for co-responsibility, for lay organization of devotional events at schools, in families, in parishes, and for the kind of catechetical and evangelizing like talk that goes with it, to bring along the people who are only at the low stake stage. The lay people are perfectly suited for that. We know what that's like. We know what it's like to feel on the outside, or to feel like maybe we're not welcome, or maybe we're not worthy. How about that one? That's a deep one. So it's these low stakes things, they create evangelizing environments which order towards the higher stakes thing, because the higher stakes thing, the Eucharist, is Christ's solidarity with the lowest of the low. He joined the low stakes people. That's what he did in the incarnation. Okay, so there's a lot of examples, but I'm not going to spend my time giving examples, but I just want to point to one. You can think of a lot of them. I'd like to think of what I'm talking about as a sort of Pope Francis thing. A lot of people notice when Pope Francis talks about Catholic social teaching, but they don't notice when he talks about the devotional life, and he does both. And there's an invitation there, I think, to the imagination. So I picked this one, the devotion to Mary, Mother of the Church, which was decreed by Pope Francis in May 2018, based on a text that the Congregation for Sacred Worship developed in February 2018. And I've got on the handout a brief extract from Pope Francis's, from that text. Yeah, sorry, I'm confusing myself. The mother standing beneath the cross accepted her son's testament of love and welcomed all people in the person of the beloved disciple as sons and daughters, welcomed all people in the person of the beloved disciple as sons and daughters to be reborn unto life eternal. She just became the tender mother of the church, which Christ begot on the cross, handing on the Spirit. This celebration will help us to remember that growth in the Christian life must be anchored to the mystery of the cross, to the oblation of Christ in the Eucharistic banquet, and to the mother of the Redeemer and mother of the redeemed, the Virgin who makes her offering to God. The idea being that by Mary's yes, her free assent to her vocation, assenting to becoming the mother of God, the mother of Jesus, she also assented to becoming the mother of all of us. And that vocation was verified at the foot of the cross, where the cost of it to her, in a sense, was finally and fully received by her. So that becoming mother of all of us meant, in a sense, at that moment, giving up the one status she had, which was mother of Jesus. Not that she's not mother of Jesus, but what it means is being mother of Jesus is being not attached to that status. And in that non-attachment, she's the mother of all of us, in the person of the beloved disciple. And so you can see how devotion to Mary, Mother of the Church, is devotion to this, to the hospitality of Mary, which is perfectly configured to the Eucharistic solidarity of Jesus with all of us. Just an example. There's all kinds of examples, and we're going to hear about some of them from our panelists, I think, because this reaches out into family, into school, into parish. It's the beauty of it. It reaches right into the places where lay people are so needed, and where the witness, the leadership level witness of lay people is needed. So thanks, friends. That's my presentation.
Thanks so much, John. I think we've already have 4 or 5 questions that have come in. Feel free to continue to use the Zoom group chat to submit your questions or thoughts. But I wanted to turn to our first panelist, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Maria Morrow of Seton Hall University. She's the author of two books, Sin in the 60s, Catholics and Confession, 1955 to 1975. Perhaps for some of you, you were active and around then, so perhaps it's a biography of your lives. I'm just kidding. And then a busy parent's guide to a meaningful Lent that's coming out with Our Sunday Visitor in 2021. Thanks so much for joining us, Maria.
Yes. All right, so Tim mentioned that I'm here in New Jersey, but I actually was raised in Iowa, and I've been a practicing Catholic basically my whole life. Until recently, I could say I basically had never missed Sunday Mass in my entire life. But perhaps because of what Dr. Cavadini was describing about the loss of devotional life, being raised in the 80s and 90s, I basically had no devotional life at all. My faith was really only about Sunday Mass, not eating meat on Fridays, occasional confession. I guess that's about it. So it wasn't until I went to college that I really fell in love with the faith, and it was partly through studying theology, and then also through attending daily Mass. And again, this is where I really felt a connection hearing Dr. Cavadini speak about this, because until I started attending daily Mass, I didn't really have any sense of the liturgical calendar and of all the saints and feasts that the church celebrate. So as I became more immersed in that, I just found that I had been really missing out on so much that could strengthen my faith. So I also want to note that I don't work for the church. I've never been on the payroll of a parish or anything like that. However, this description of co-responsibility really has a familiar feeling for me. And listening to the description, I can say that looking back and even looking at my current life, I've really shared in this co-responsibility of evangelization and the mission of the church. So I think sometimes we laity have a tendency to let the parish or even a priest limit us. And I've heard various complaints to the effect of, oh, the parish should be doing this, or the church ought to be doing this. And I think this can be a really problematic view, because we are the church. It's not something separate from us that we can sort of push responsibility onto the parish or onto our pastor. If there's something really important that we think should be done, we should be able to do it in some way, contributing to this mission. So I would say the devotional life is a really great opportunity for this. And I'm going to talk about it under two headings. First, the joys and hopes of life. And secondly, the griefs and anxieties of life. All right, so starting with the joys and hopes. So I'm the mother of 7 children ranging from age 14 down to 3 months old. And of course, I want to raise my children in the faith. But like a lot of Catholic parents, I do have a fear that my children might grow up to leave the church. And so I've kind of made it one of my goals as a mother to try to find ways to make Catholicism seem really fun and appealing. So I know it's kind of tricky, right? Like I'm trying to trick them. But so here are some of the ways that I do that. We celebrate some of their baptism anniversaries. Especially I have 2 that were baptized on the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord. So we always make a really big deal out of that. We also have chosen some really great saints' names for our children. So we like to celebrate those name days in special ways with them choosing desserts and, learning about the saints they're named after. And then now that I know the liturgical calendar of the church, I'm really big on celebrating solemnities, which are the highest ranked feasts in the church. I always try to mention them to my children and find some way to celebrate them. And, my children, it's good to see that they seem to be sort of picking up on the liturgical calendar a little bit themselves. And a lot of times, even if they're in the mood for dessert, they'll try to figure out whose feast day it might be. That might be a good excuse for me to make a dessert for them. But, they know, like on March 19th that we're going to get these delicious pastries, the Italian pastries from the bakery to celebrate St. Joseph. And they know I'm going to make a birthday cake for Mary on her birthday. And we have a son named St. Nicholas now. And they always put their shoes out December 5th so they can get goodies from St. Nicholas. They also always look forward to blowing out the candles on the Advent wreath. And during the octave of Easter, we have our 8 days of dessert for the octave of Easter. And, I try to make it not just about sort of a superficial fun, but I try to sort of incorporate some education when I do this by having dinner time quizzes. And a lot of times I try to prime them during the day, and especially to give my younger ones, I'll talk to the younger ones about what we're celebrating so that they'll be the ones that know the answers at the dinner table. So for example, today is the Nativity of John the Baptist. So tonight I'll probably ask them some questions like, does anyone know why he's called John the Baptist? Can anyone tell me the names of his parents? What's happening 6 months from today, right? Does anyone happen to know the gruesome ending that St. John the Baptist suffered? So questions like that. And then I know it can be a lot to get through, but anyway, they'll be rewarded at the end with some peach cobbler, and hopefully, you know, they'll have tried to, it'll be in their memory, and then next year, guess what? We'll do it all over again. They'll have the chance to answer all those questions again. So, okay, so far it might sound like this is kind of just sort of narrowly focused on the family, but I haven't really found that to be so. Not only because we have, you know, visitors in and out of our house, which is true, but also we like to have parties for saints, and we're kind of nerdy. So we had a big party one year for St. Thomas Aquinas in January, which was a lot of fun. And we had, you know, people sitting around talking about Thomas Aquinas, which was cool. We have a son named Patrick, our oldest son. We're very big on St. Patrick, and I'm partly Irish. So we often have parties on St. Patrick's Day. And one year we even had all of our friends gather around in a circle, and we read aloud the Confessions of St. Patrick, which if you haven't read it, you should. It's a brief document. It's easy to read in a setting like that. And it goes really well with Guinness. So anyway, and then I want to also note that we've found this devotional life to also be really complementary with our parish. So we don't, as Dr. Cavadini was saying, it's not like some competition necessarily. And we're really lucky. We have a great parish. We have a priest that's also into devotionalism, and we have lay organizations like the Knights of Columbus and the Women's Auxiliary that put on some really great events. So I mentioned before that we like to celebrate the Feast of St. Nicholas. Well, our parish also has a St. Nicholas party, and they have St. Nicholas come, like actually St. Nicholas, not just Santa Claus, and he hands out gold coins, or chocolate coins, and candy canes, and they give a little history on the Feast of St. Nicholas, and then Santa Claus does come in at the end for photos. But anyway, so it kind of shows our kids that it's not just us, we're not just like weird people that like saints, but it's really connected to the parish and all these Catholics celebrating it. And then also another thing our parish does, when we moved to New Jersey, we joined the parish nearest us, which we assumed was our, local parish, but it turned out to be an Italian national parish. And neither of us are Italian, but anyway, our parish is they're really into all the Italian saints. So from St. Rocco to Padre Pio, but the biggest, of course, is St. Anthony of Padua. So every year, unfortunately, we missed it this year with the coronavirus, but our parish has a big feast for St. Anthony with all the typical rides and lots of Italian desserts and games and everything. But the best part is that we actually do the procession through town behind the statue of St. Anthony, with the dollar bills around his neck and everything. And our parish donates 10% of the proceeds to the poor every year as well. But my children, they think this is a normal thing to sort of walk behind a statue through town with a police escort and a band. So that's kind of cool that they are getting to have that experience as well, even though we're not Italian. All right, so that's a little bit about the joys and hopes of evangelization. And next, I want to talk about the griefs and anxieties of the church, because of course we know that life isn't really just about the joys and the hopes that we have. There's also a lot of difficulty in the everyday kind of grind of life. So here I want to just give a mention of guardian angels, because once again, we live in New Jersey and the driving here is absolutely crazy. And there's never a day that when we pull out of the driveway in our van, we always say a prayer to our guardian angels for protection and help while we're in the car. And then I have daredevil kids, including four young sons, like to climb trees and do crazy things. So I just find myself always talking to their angels. And then, I also turn to all of our guardian angels for spiritual help. And what I mean by this is I ask their angels to help them behave better at Mass, and for me to be patient during Mass and to remember that, you know, if we look at the makeup of our family, we've got all these angels that are on my side wanting them to worship well at Mass. So really there's more people on my team than on theirs if they're trying not to do that. So anyway, and then also beyond the guardian angels, of course, St. Michael has been really important lately in these last few years for us, and in the last few months as well with the coronavirus, as someone that we see as a saint that's really providing protection for us. It's easy prayer to memorize and to say frequently. Okay, now also in relation to griefs and anxieties, we find that just kind of living the Catholic life and living a devotional life, we do have people that get into tough situations and somehow they know we're Catholic, even though, you know, we don't wear any buttons that say we're Catholic or anything. We don't have any Catholic t-shirts at all, but we, you know, people in the neighborhood know that. And my children go to a public school, but we find ourselves often being asked questions about the church, like, oh, you know, I never had my daughter baptized. Do you think I should go? And questions like that, where we find that we can give people advice and they have an opening to speak to us about it because they can see our faith through the devotional life. And then another important aspect of addressing the griefs and anxieties is that I think we all have numerous times when people will ask us to pray for them. And I've heard it said before that the biggest lie a Christian ever tells is like, yes, yes, I'll pray for you. And then of course they don't. So it can be hard to make something really concrete. But the devotional life, again, it provides a really great opportunity to make prayer for other people concrete. So, and in particular, there's novenas. We have a particular novena that we use for our friends that are unemployed and family members seeking work, or yeah, people that have been out of work and they've asked us to pray for them. And we don't want to just say, oh yeah, we'll pray for you. And we want to make it really concrete. So we do a novena for them. We've also had friends that were really sick, or their children were really sick. And then, you know, we'll do a novena for healing for them. And it makes you feel like you're actually making an effort beyond sort of the casual, oh yeah, I'll pray for you. So also related to this is the rosary. And I didn't grow up praying the rosary. It's something I came to later in life, partly when I was living in California among a Hispanic community that was really big on the rosary. But it's something that I've kept up. And I've found that it really tends to bring people together. I think because our mother is always there, ready to listen to us. So I'm very grateful. I belong to a rosary group of women, and this was not a parish initiative. And in fact, the women in the group, there's about 15 of us, and we belong to about 4 different parishes. I think one of us is a director of religious education, but everybody else, that we're just women whose kids go to Catholic schools, public schools. Somehow we found each other. One of my friends I found at the swimming pool and started talking to her and invited her to Rosary Group. And it's a great way that we can pray for each other's intentions, pray for needs of our community, and also then just go out into the world and live our lives, and we feel really strengthened doing that. And then as a final example, in the last, a couple months ago, I guess, a good friend of mine lost her father to the coronavirus. And of course, my husband and I wanted to really pray for the repose of the soul of her father. And we had a mass said for the repose of the soul of her father. But we also, again, we wanted it to feel more concrete. And it was the month of May, so we decided to go on a socially distanced Marian pilgrimage. And basically we met at our house. She and her husband stayed 6 feet apart from me and my husband. And we prayed a rosary walking to a nearby parish. And then we stopped in front of the Mary statue. We said another rosary. And then we walked home saying another rosary. And we had plenty of time to also chat from 6 feet away during this. And at the end of it, it felt like we had really done something to pray for the repose of the soul of her father and to ease her in this time of grief and anxiety. So that was really meaningful. So as you can see, there's a lot of options to the devotional life, and I wouldn't say I ever feel overwhelmed, but on the other hand, I could see people might think that they need to be really perfect, or they need to honor every single saint in the church, which just would not be possible. But I think the important thing here is that we see that we're willing to make an effort. Again, not for show or out of a sense of duty, but just because we really love God. And if we're willing to make these efforts, it's a way that we will be sharing in the daily lives of people, joining in their joys and their hopes and their griefs and anxieties. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. And I think you've given us a good deal to witness to, grounded in your own sort of practice of this devotional life, although grounded itself in a kind of deep theory of discipleship that you've undertaken. Thank you. Lastly, and so make sure that you keep those questions coming in. We have a number. We'd like to see more. The last question I have, or the last sort of introduction I have for our final panelist is Anna Nussbaum Keating, a resident of Colorado. She's the author of the Catholic Catalog, which takes up a number of the devotions and ideas that Maria has presented. She's also written for a variety of Catholic publications and non-Catholic publications, but she's written for First Things, for America Magazine, and I think most importantly for our own Church Life Journal. And so it's we're happy to invite Anna in from Colorado. Hi, Anna.
Hi, thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me? I live above a handmade furniture studio, so if you hear a saw whirring in the background, don't be alarmed. You can hear me, yes? I am so happy to be here. I wrote this book with my mom called The Catholic Catalog. It's a field guide to the daily acts that make up a Catholic life. I think my mom was a lot like Maria. She was an incredible mom, like Maria Morrow, who just spoke. She kept all of the feast days, or a lot of the liturgical calendar, alive in our home. So I sort of joke that my Catholicism was very matriarchal, in the sense that I got so much of it from my mother. And as little kids, I was one of 5 kids. Our favorite day was St. Lucy's Day, because we would have breakfast in bed, and she would come in. I would get to wear the candles on my head. They were electric candles, but it was still cool. And we would sing "The King Shall Come When Morning Dawns" and light triumphant breaks. And we would go from room to room and bring a cinnamon roll, I believe, and some tea. And everyone thought, like, this is religion, like, this is a religion I can sign up for, breakfast in bed. But when I became a parent myself, I noticed that even though I wanted so much to keep the devotional life and the sense of mystery and richness alive with my own children, that big surprise, I'm not my mother. And so we do it a little bit differently. For one, I don't bake, but there's a lot of ways to keep a rich devotional life alive in your own heart and in the hearts of your family. There's not one way to do it. So I'm going to mention a few things that I might say are devotional practices for slackers. And I would count myself among them. Table prayers. Only 44% of Americans report saying a blessing even once a day before eating. This is a great place to start. We don't have to be perfect. The perfect is not the enemy of the good, but we do need to pray. And a great place to begin with prayer is at table. Of course, we inherited the practice of saying a prayer both before and after meals, like most of our best stuff from Judaism. So I think it'd be a great thing if you work in a parish to give people a prayer that they can say. A lot of the reasons why we don't engage in devotional practices is because we're afraid that we'll do it wrong or that we don't know how. That's why I wrote that field guide. But you could even just give them, the "Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts." And then at the end of the meal, the lesser known conclusion, which is, "We give thee thanks for all thy benefits, Almighty God, who lives and reigns forever." I think that one small thing could be a life-changing practice for an individual or a household to pray before and after meals, because the table is a way into the Eucharistic life, which Professor Cavadini spoke about, and it's a way into gratitude. We've found that children who pray before eating are more grateful. And there's this book called The Opposite of Spoiled that I'm getting this from. They're even more likely to not go into debt, for example, because someone who is aware of the blessings that they have is more grateful for what they have and is less likely to always look for more. So when we say, "Thank you, God, for what we have," we acknowledge that there is a God, that it is not us, and that what we have is good. And then social scientists have even found that the food tastes better after this pause, this practice of mindfulness, of appreciating it. So we're not just kind of going through the motions, but we're actually tasting the food and taking a moment to be grateful for what is on our plate. And then, of course, that also connects, as Professor Cavadini mentioned, to Catholic social teaching, because when we are aware of our blessings, we must also be mindful of those who go without. Here we have food on our plates, while many people do not have even the bare necessities for life. So as people who have been given enough to eat, or more than enough to eat, how then can we be generous? So I think these small places, a table blessing before and after meal, or committing to eating with people, not just by ourselves, can radically transform a home into a place in which God is loved and known and served. There's a part from my book that says, a blessing realigns our world with heaven by acknowledging that all is gift. So another place where we can have blessings, I would say, is to bless our children. Again, I feel sometimes like we think we have to go to a priest for an official blessing, but that parents can also offer their blessing, just to take your thumb and bless your child in the sign of the cross on their forehead. I remember after my daughter was born, a lay minister came to our hospital room. He was an elderly gentleman, to bring us the Eucharist. And how much it meant to me, how profoundly moving it was. This was not a priest, but he greeted me and my newborn daughter as sisters in Christ. And he said, "May I pray with you?" And those little moments are a great blessing. And that was the first time when I remember crossing my newborn daughter's forehead with the sign of the cross. So again, this didn't happen in a church setting, but it was a profound moment of claiming her for Christ, and of having this connection with a stranger that was still profoundly intimate. I also think when you bless your children, there's this lovely image in scripture that I'm sure we all know of, putting on Christ as almost a clothing. My children also go to public school. They also go out into a world that can be harsh and difficult. This kind of blessing can stay with them as a kind of reminder of a deeper reality of who they are and who they were claimed for in their baptism. Before Vatican II, not to get nostalgic, but a lot of Catholics kept holy water in their homes so that they could bless themselves on occasion before maybe you're going to work. You could bless yourself with the sign of the cross, or maybe in a time of trial. So having holy water in your home, that's another thing you can give to people in your parish. Here is some holy water. Make it easy for them to give a blessing. I work in campus ministry at Carter College, which is a very secular university, and I had an African-American student say to me that she missed so much her grandmother's blessing. I think her grandmother was from a holiness church. And she said, when I go home, my grandmother anoints me with oil. And here at Carter College, I'm told that, Christianity is stupid. I only am a Christian because of slavery. But when my grandmother anoints me with oil, she said, I feel something and it makes me feel good. And I think sometimes devotional practices do not have to be something that we fully understand. There's a way in which her grandmother's blessing connects her to herself, to God, to her deepest and highest self, that she cannot fully even articulate, but that her blessing has formed her. And so we need to empower lay people to bless one another and to bless themselves in their homes. And then also for more things for slackers, devotional practices. Litanies are really great for slackers. Sometimes my family and I, my kids are very, a euphemistic way to say it would be high energy. The entire rosary is not gonna work for my children. So a litany is really wonderful. We pick one saint, that's doable. My family owns a handmade furniture business, so our saint is Saint Joseph, and we pray on a regular basis to him. The Litany of Saint Joseph is so beautiful, and you really cannot get it wrong because you just say, "Have mercy on us," after every line. And so these are wonderful devotions that anyone of any age or any ability can join into. And I also think that these litanies are poetry. Just hearing the different names, whether it's the Sacred Heart of Jesus or the different names for Joseph, Joseph most just, Joseph most chaste, Joseph most prudent, Joseph most strong. These are virtues. These are profound ways of naming what it means to be part of God's family, to be a friend of Jesus. It's a wonderful way to connect to the dead, lover of poverty, model of artisans, glory of home life. So these poems and prayers are perhaps above us, but we can enter into them again and again and again and meditate on them over the course of our lifetime. And I find that this kind of repetition is very comforting and very soothing, and getting to know even one saint as a family can be a wonderful way into the communion of saints. And then the last thing I'll say is, I could say more, of course, but I happen to be in a state of life, and I think many Catholics are. Colorado Springs Catholics are very minority here. It's a very mission territory. And it just happens to be the case that I don't have many friends who are Catholic. Most of my friends are fellow parents or neighbors, and most of them are nuns, like secular, grew up with nothing. And so I think it can be somewhat difficult at times to invite people to participate in the life of your domestic church if they didn't also grow up in this crazy and beautiful religion. But I would encourage you to do so. So another place for blessing, I've talked about blessing in terms of a table prayer, blessing food, blessing children and yourself with the sign of the cross. And now I'm going to talk about blessing a home or a space. When I move into a new home, or in this case, my husband and I are building a shop for our woodworking building in the backyard. When it's done, I would like to bless that space. So this is where we do a little domestic procession. It's important to know going into these kind of things that everything in the world is going to go wrong. You know, someone's going to hold the holy water and they're going to spill it. Maybe someone will hold a candle and they will like cry because there'll be wax on them. This is okay. We're not performers, we're human beings, and a blessing is real, it's real life. But let's say we decide to do a blessing and we want to include people beside just our immediate nuclear family. Well, we might invite friends who are not Catholic. And I think we should encourage people not to be afraid to do that. Let's say you're going to do a May crowning in your backyard. Well, you may come and just listen while we sing a song, Hail Holy Queen or something. You may come and just listen while we bless this new building, but then afterwards there will probably be something good to eat. So you're going to have a good time. There's nothing to worry about, and we kind of have to get over our self-consciousness, both our own self-consciousness that we're used to thinking of Mass as kind of a performance that a professional does. Well, this is not that. This is our home. And so it's not going to be perfect, and we're not performers, we're real people. But also this sense of people want to be asked to participate in something unusual or interesting or lovely. And we kind of have to get over being minorities in our culture and include people and say, hey, we're going to do a house blessing. If you would like to come, you are more than welcome to come. No worries if that's not your thing, but people usually will be surprised and will say, yes, we would love to come. And just as if a Jewish friend invited you to their child's bar mitzvah, you would say, of course, we'd love to come. What can we bring? And I think inviting people in that way into these devotional practices can be an awesome way to share a life with your friends and to be authentic with your friends. And many people will be moved because walking, singing, blessing, eating together, these are profoundly human interactions. And so even if you're not necessarily a believer, I don't think you will come away unmoved from a domestic blessing or from a procession any more than you would come away unmoved from a baptism. It is beautiful, whether or not you share that culture or belief. I could go on and on, obviously, but that's my main thing, is just trying to encourage people to start with something small and to feel encouraged that they can do it if you give them the tools. Like, here are the prayers, here is some holy water, go and bless your house. So for example, on Epiphany, give them the chalk, give them the holy water, say go from room to room and pray for each room and sprinkle the holy water, kind of give them a way into it, because many of us did not grow up with these blessings, or we feel silly. And once we do them, we realize that they are beautiful and life-giving, and there's nothing to feel silly about. The other thing I would say about blessing a space and just in general, the beauty of our life, our domestic church life, is that my daughter is 5, her name is Ruthie, and we get to the end of a book or we get to the end of a movie and she always says to me, what was the point of that? So what was the point of that? And I think that all of us are really asking ourselves that, right? Like, so what is the point of this? But as adults, we learn not to ask that question anymore and to just pretend that we know. But I love it because it's so honest. And so when you bless your house, for example, you decide as a family, as a community, what is the point of this house? And you say it like, oh, the point of this house is hospitality. We're supposed to welcome people in this house as Christ. Or this point of this house is rest. whatever it is, whatever you pray for as you go through each room. But to make it as an intention for that space. And then to think of your space as not just a place where you throw your things or where you sleep or where you shower, but as a place that is part and parcel of your Christian life. And that is a holy space in a way, even though it's not the same as the church, it is important as well. And so we're not just kind of doing something and not really knowing why we're doing it. And so I also think that these devotions are wonderful reminders that get us to stop and slow down and say, what is the point of my bedroom? And then your child might say, I pray that this be a room for, not fighting with my sister. Even that is a beginning to thinking, what do I hope for? What am I asking God for this space? And so those are some things I would suggest as easy places to begin to have a devotional life if you are like me and a bit of a slacker.
Anna, thank you so much for that. Lisa, of course, in the group chat noted that she sometimes gets funny looks when she blesses her IPA while out. So Lisa, you sound like an amazing person. We'd love to welcome you to Notre Dame again sometime. So, and we'd love to share an IPA with you. All right, so we received a number of questions, and questions are still coming in. We have about 10 minutes. We won't have time to answer all those questions, but we want to get to some of them. So the first question we received is from Sister Celeste from San Francisco. Sister Celeste?
Hello. My question was, in dealing with church life right now, we see a lot of poor theological devotions surfacing. And how do we as church deal with that in a welcoming, evangelizing way with the people we want to call to prayer?
I think I've had maybe some experience like this when I was living in Southern California. There was a lot of devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and not always a lot of mass attendance on Sundays, I guess. Now, I don't know if this is helpful at all, but I once had a friend of mine say to me during lunch, like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat meat today, right? So I shouldn't go get a hamburger. And I said, well, yeah, but like, you need to go to mass on Sunday, because, he hadn't been to mass in a very, very long time. So I don't know if that helps. Like, sometimes you have to be direct and talk to people about whatever it is you feel they're missing out, in a kind of way, in an understanding way. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but.
Sister Gina, just to note in the side, makes some recommendations that maybe parishes should present some principles or ideas for evaluating certain devotions. Perhaps that's one helpful way. All right, our next question is from Vincent Riley.
Hey, my question has to do with the sense of Eucharist that we were discussing earlier. Perhaps, do we need to have an expanded sense of Eucharist in terms of giving thanks for our lives? I think some of the panelists answered that already, but this sense of the Christian life is learning how to say thank you better. And then do the devotions also come to us from Acts 2:42 as referenced in your article?
Well, I couldn't say it better myself. So I think, a Eucharistic sensibility is a sensibility of gratitude. And it seems to me that, that to the extent that devotion is an expression of gratitude, it isn't expanded, I guess. It's the Eucharist expanding into the rest of our life, especially our prayer life. I don't know. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, there's evidence, Vincent, that like in the medieval Catholicism, when they spoke about what we would call devotions or practices, that they had various degrees of Eucharistic, that they were variously Eucharistic, all of them, so that they always were understood in light of the Eucharist, precisely because Eucharistic identity was so connected to sacrifice and that gratitude and that sacrifice of love. I can send you the article sometime if you're interested. Okay, Sister Gina also has a question about co-responsibility in the devotions.
Question. Oh, I was I was wondering about, I mean, might there be some ways that we can help foster these kinds of practices in a well-grounded way? I mean, I think it's the same conversation we've been sort of having in terms of how do we situate a healthy devotional life in relationship to a healthy liturgical and Eucharistic life. Maybe it's just a question of catechesis. Nothing too concrete in the question, but that's basically what I'm thinking about.
I think a lot of it is by example, and sounds like you have a fantastic example to offer. I think probably you're doing this already quite efficaciously. So I think nothing like there's lots of different ways of doing it, but someone who exemplifies it without being pushy about it, but exemplifies it without being sanctimonious, I would say. And also pointing to the example of the saints. There's a lot of different saints, a lot of different temperaments, a lot of different ways of integrating. I think the saints aren't sanctimonious if they're really saints. Sanctimoniousness is off-putting, to say the least.
So I noticed, just as a question, just between all three of you, you all sort of spoke about kind of the devotions as a kind of easy way to evangelize. How would you recommend that someone start doing that who feels really awkward about talking about their faith at all, right? I mean, I'm Irish Catholic. I grew up in an awkward way of talking about anything publicly religious. How do I improve myself?
Huh. Oh man, Irish Catholic. I'm married to an Irish Catholic. He doesn't even want to sing at church, let alone in our domestic church. So you guys are difficult people. But we love you. I would say that you can always start with something where you memorize something. Like, let's say you decide we're going to light a candle and say a blessing. I find like smells and bells work at home too, because I'm just a distracted person. And so sometimes lighting a candle, for example, gets everybody's focus without saying, shh, be quiet. So let's say you read like John 8:12 as you light the candle and you say that little prayer, like, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. Something that you Irish people can have that's by memory. So you don't have to get too spontaneous, and get out of your comfort zone can be a good place to start. But you never know, that could lead to extemporaneous prayer, Tim, and you just don't know where it could go. So it's a beautiful way to begin. And then maybe, who knows, you'll be just speaking from your heart one of these days. We don't know.
All right, so we're at the end of our hour, and we have the group chat, which of course we'll send out, has so many good ideas and suggestions. I hope you consult it. Also, if you have other questions or things you want to share, you can email me directly at tomalley@nd.edu. I'll type that in just so that we can continue sharing, I think, what was a very fruitful conversation. I want to thank our panelists, John, Maria, and Anna, and looking forward to what happens next.